So you're a former U.S. Army major and Defense Intelligence Agency officer who resigned in November 2023. You gained national attention for being one of the first military and intelligence officers to publicly quit and protest over unconditional U.S. military support for Israel during its genocide in Gaza.
Yeah, so I was a career Army officer, about 13 years active duty Army. At that point, I was a major, and I happened to be assigned to something called the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is like a mini CIA that works for the Pentagon. And I was in an office focused on intelligence analysis and intelligence sharing related to the Middle East and Africa.
Now you're writing for Zitium, doing other things. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
What's the single through line connecting everything you've been reporting on? And what should we kind of take away?
Two of the driving impulses of American politics, domestic or foreign, it's corruption, right? That's what ICE is about, in our cities here. It's what this drone strikes, airstrikes on fishermen in the Caribbean is also about. The Iran war is a product of corrupt politics that allow, some really dangerous opinions to get elevated above others because they were able to pay to help get members of Congress elected, because there's people who have incredible financial benefit when the U.S. prepares for war or goes to war. These are all symptoms of the same impulses, same trends that certainly didn't start with Trump. Trump's just the most obvious and sort of cartoonishly obvious manifestation of them, right? He's not just starting a war alongside Israel. His son-in-law is trying to sell air defenses to the Saudis during the war that they started, right? He's not just, saying welfare queens. He's making sure that federal agents go to beat up Latinos and catch it on camera so they can post it on Twitter for his followers. It is kind of near the terminal endpoint of where you get if you don't stand up to corruption, you don't stand up to racism.
I met you in Beirut in 2009 when we were at the American University of Beirut at the King's program for Arabic. So we took Arabic sort of separately but together. And then after that, you spent the next decade inside Army and intelligence institutions working and focusing on the Middle East. And then now, you resign in November 2023 because of Gaza and our sort of unfettered support as a country for Israel's weapons and violence in Gaza. Walk us through how being inside of the Army, inside of that experience and inside of intelligence agencies, how that informs how you write, how you think now. Like, what is it do you think it comes down to that you can offer people when you're giving your analysis?
Politicians and the public, often in good faith, believes that the U.S. military can do anything. And that's a really, really dangerous fallacy, because if you believe that, then you start trying to use the U.S. military to deal with everything. And it's really important to understand, we may be the most expensive military in the world. It's probably the best military in the world by most metrics, and it can't do everything. And if you try and get it to do a lot of things, as we're seeing now in Iran, you're going to be very disappointed and you're going to have caused a lot of disasters for nothing. Unfortunately, I think both in a lot of political circles and in a lot of media, you can't make those criticisms unless you have some connection to the military, or you are limited in how much people will accept your criticisms. You are shielded. You are get a little bit of a shield and a little more credibility, saying sometimes very obvious things like, "Hey, having the U.S. military attack Iran will end badly if you have some connection to the military world or to the national security world."
Given all of this experience, what can you say about where we stand with the war on Iran? Can you give us like an update on the failure of negotiations and the escalation that's happening right now?
For years, I've resisted explaining what's going on by just saying like Trump is dumb. Yeah, Trump derangement syndrome, to like explain this event, which I would say is the culmination of decades of bad U.S. policy and pernicious influences within D.C. There is the Trump dumb aspect. Which is he expected the war is going to be over in 72 hours. And from then through now, he has not fully internalized the limits of what he can achieve with military power. And that's why we are now in this Groundhog Day cycle of negotiate, threaten, blockade. We're now trying the blockade that didn't work a second time, doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. But then the second part of that is like, okay, Trump is dumb. Who's convincing him of these things, right? And then you get back to the systemic issues of like, well, why does the Israeli prime minister get so much access to the president? Why do people who told him the war was going to go great get so much access to the president? And that goes beyond just Trump's personal peculiarities. But where we are with the war now is Trump reached 2 months ago the limits of what he could achieve with military power by continually reneging on promises and tweeting threats in the middle of negotiations and changing his mind from day to day or even hour to hour. He has convinced the Iranians that he cannot be negotiated with, that there is no benefit, at least right now, in negotiating with him because he can't be trusted to maintain the same position for 48 hours. And so because of that, the rational position from the Iranian point of view is basically inflict enough pain on Trump that he sues for peace. And the best way for them to do it, and really the only way for them to do that, is by continuing to cause a global economic crisis by blocking energy flows. And so that's where we are. Again, the other side of this, right, is the other reason the Strait of Hormuz is so important is because due to Trump's duplicity and capriciousness, none of the other promised benefits of peace are things Iran expects anymore, right? None of the sanctions relief, none of the unfrozen bank accounts that they were hoping to get out of negotiations. These aren't things that they can rely on Trump to deliver anymore, no matter what. So the only thing they're certain they can get out of this war is control of the Strait of Hormuz. And when I say control, I don't mean what they have now, which is they basically do have de facto veto over traffic in it, but they're shooting for internationally recognized control, where they don't have to shoot at people to decide when traffic goes in and out. They have countries or companies asking for passage and paying for that privilege.
The U.S. tried to set up its own capacity to pass through, I think like the southern part or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then Iran responded by shooting. And then there's been this like Trump talking about 20% tariff and then walking it back. Like, what do you think people don't understand about the Strait of Hormuz and how important it is?
The Strait of Hormuz, it's a maritime choke point, and about 30% of the world's oil and gas pass through it to be exported to the world. It mostly goes to Asia, right? The U.S. doesn't really import that much energy, so we don't depend on it, but the rest of the world does. And not only do energy products go out of it, so does 20 to 30% of the world's fertilizer. So global agriculture also depends on it. So sealing off all those products is already causing like a food crisis, agriculture crisis that we are going to feel in the U.S. in coming months. Other poorer countries are already suffering from it, and it's causing a global energy crisis where the countries in Asia and to a lesser extent Europe that depended on this oil and gas are having to do without. And so then what happens is when they can't buy Gulf Arab or sometimes, in Iranian products, they buy American, which is great for American oil barons. But it means when you go to the gas pump, for those of us who have cars, instead of paying for gas, you are now bidding against corporations in Japan or India that now need to buy this gas and are willing to pay much more than you. So that's why even though the U.S. is not really like running out of energy products the way that Asia literally is, it's still getting much more expensive for us and will continue to as U.S. producers decide to sell at higher prices to other countries.
And then how's it affecting like the Gulf Arab states and Europe and some of our allies, like Asia is also like just totally underwater because of these decisions. Like, how does that affect our relationships?
Trump's war on Iran was a wake-up call for countries that had not gotten the message yet, that they should not be depending on the United States for their security needs. They should not be depending on the United States as a provider of global goods, like protecting waterways, like avoiding global financial crises. And so everyone's understandably quite mad. Trump didn't tell anybody, not our treaty allies in Europe and Asia, not our de facto allies or protectorates in the Middle East, all of these Gulf Arab countries that he may have quite close personal relationships with. He didn't tell anyone he was going to do this. The reason why is not just because he wanted to be surprised, but because Trump personally had no idea any of this was going to happen. I think Marco Rubio did. I think JD Vance did. You can go down the list. But Trump himself did not think this was going to happen and didn't think there was anything to warn anybody about, because it was going to be a lightning blitzkrieg strike and be over in that weekend. And so understandably, rest of the world's quite upset. Countries around the world, I think, are accelerating their hedging against the United States. When we talk about the Gulf states, there have been a variety of reactions, but most of them, with the exception of the United Arab Emirates, are doing what they can to make peace with Iran. You see new trends. This predates the war, but like Saudi Arabia trying to have a security or defense pact with Pakistan. I think we're going to see more countries doing that. We're going to see more countries trying to get closer to Turkey. They're not going to abandon the U.S. That's still not really an option for them. They're still dependent on U.S. weapons and to a much lesser extent, U.S. protection, which didn't turn out to be that valuable, but they're moving away. The UAE is a special case that seems to have taken this opportunity to double down on alliance with America and Israel. I thought that was a crazy gamble. We now learned one reason they might have done it was to get access to advanced microchips. We could have a whole second discussion about the wisdom of the UAE trying to become a hub for data centers. I don't know why putting data centers in one of the hottest parts of the world next to a heavily armed adversary is a good long-term investment. But yeah, it's in short, right, launching a surprise war that disrupts the entire global economy and it's threatening a global recession, which at this rate I think we'll still get, is very, very frustrating to America's allies.
And it's, just to sort of give this context, you have the idea that Trump is dumb, right? Like, we're making this very simple, but we're reducing it to that. And then you have Israel, who is hell-bent on successfully doing whatever it wants to do, which is sort of destabilize the region, I guess, in order for its own growth and its own colonialism and expansion. And then you have Iran curiously becoming like a fourth world power because of all this, because of the Strait, because of what you've expressed. And that I think is really interesting, because this war has sort of shaken up the entire global hierarchy.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, right? You could say this war has accelerated two trends. One of them is the unsustainability of the status quo in the Middle East, where you have the U.S. unconditionally supporting Israel getting more aggressive with its neighbors, and at the same time, the U.S. trying to bind the Gulf Arab states and Israel into a defense pact. The states that are not Israel in the region, understanding that not only Israel, but the United States will drop them the moment they're inconvenient, will use them as cannon fodder. While they may not like Iran, Iran lives in the neighborhood and they have to deal with it. And the security architecture with Israel and the US that was designed around protecting them from Iran is irrelevant, not only because it failed to protect them from Iran, but because they increasingly understand that Israel and the US are the greatest threats to their regional stability, not Iran. And so that's one shift. And then, as you said, on Iran's side, every cautious and conservative leader has been assassinated. And now you have a new generation of leaders who are the guys who always wanted a more aggressive foreign policy and see this as their opportunity to make Iran the regional power, maybe even I can't say regional hegemon because Israel's still there, but the regional power that it historically had been, and they think it rightfully should be. And that's another reason they're not going to let go of the Strait of Hormuz. And then finally, you have the other trend line, which was the end of U.S. global hegemony. Other big countries full of people around the world were inevitably going to catch up to us, right? we're no longer in a world where the United States kind of assumed this role after World War II, which was the entire world was either destroyed by World War II or was coming out of some crippling colonial arrangement, right? And so some of these countries are naturally catching up. China, India, and so I think that's the second contradiction that's being unwound. American foreign policy was still organized around the idea that we should, at least in much of the world, be the provider of a specific global order. And so that's what's also unwound.
You've been writing about this for Satya. You said that the most expensive military is losing to Iran. And you had this sort of central argument. I think you go into some details. Can you sort of lay out what your sort of central argument in that article was?
I was trying to answer the question, why can't the most expensive military in the world defeat the Iranian military? And there's the simple answer, which is no amount of investment can make up for bad strategy. But the other side of it is that the Department of Defense and the military is the product of a lot of institutionalized corruption, and because there is so much money involved in quote unquote defense, so much of our defense capabilities are tooled towards what generates profit for defense contractors or generates a benefit for the members of Congress who depend on campaign contributions from defense contractors, and so need to appropriate for this stuff. I use that to explain why the first U.S. KIAs in this war were killed in a very preventable way. It was a handful of soldiers who were operating out of basically, think of a trailer park trailer, the military version of that, and were killed by a drone with no adequate air defenses, with no netting or shelters that might have stopped it. Really, really rudimentary stuff. Why didn't they have that? Because for decades, right, our choices about how we equip the military have largely been dominated by what can we buy that's expensive, that's going to enrich a lot of people. And this is not like a conspiracy. It's not secret. There's huge structural incentives to buy big, expensive things. If you're a member of Congress, you want to appropriate tax dollars for this because it might mean jobs in your district that help you get elected. It definitely means that defense contractors are going to donate to your campaign. If you're in the military itself, this is something I learned researching the article. Even if you're a very professional green suiter general, you also want to buy more expensive stuff because it makes your service look more important. So if the Air Force budget is bigger than the Navy budget this year, that's a sign that you're doing your job well and you've gotten more goodies for your team within the bureaucracy. And so the other side of that, there's much less incentive to focus on things that are cheaper and don't make anybody rich. Mm-hmm. Nets, bunkers. We sort of belatedly have used some of the cheaper Ukraine-developed anti-drone systems, but we could have had those years ago. And it comes back to, there's no plot. It's just in terms of what gets prioritized by politicians and by leaders is going to be the stuff that's big and expensive and prestigious. This war would have gone quite badly no matter what, but you could imagine U.S. forces doing a little better and dying less if there had been investments made in the really obvious protections you would need for our bases in the Middle East. And I've served on a number of these bases, and yeah, they're incredibly vulnerable. There's sometimes an outdoor bunker you can run to. That's the case on the bases in Kuwait. In Bahrain, there's like one or two buildings you could go into, but if you're not in that building when an attack happens, you're out of luck. And that's what's happened since this war began.
You also point to things like the USS Ford's toilet failures and the littoral combat ship's mine clearing failures as symptoms of the general deep problem. Is this?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, the mine clearing is a great example of basically something that, again, it's turned out to be a quite critical capability as Iran lays mines in the Strait of Hormuz. And it's a program that was less interesting and less profit generating than building a giant aircraft carrier, than building an F-35. On the spectrum of ships that you can buy, mine clearance ship is pretty rudimentary, not that expensive, doesn't create that many jobs. So instead, They tried to give that mission to something called the Littoral Combat Ship, which has become like a case study in failed defense procurement. Basically, the Navy the Navy hates it. I'm not sure at what point the Navy stopped wanting it, but it's one example of one of these programs that because it's creating jobs somewhere, because the manufacturers are invested in it, because members of Congress are invested in it, gets pushed through. And then the aircraft carrier bathrooms are a really interesting story. So early in this war, one of the aircraft carriers that was supposed to head into this theater had to turn around for repairs. We think because disgruntled sailors clogged the toilets, but because of how the toilets were designed, instead of just breaking the bathroom in like one part of the ship, it ruined the plumbing in much or all of the ship, so they had to go back. By the way, the reason the sailors were probably disgruntled is that this ship had previously been deployed for the illegal U.S. intervention in Venezuela when Iran kicked off, so they'd been out at sea much longer than expected. The reasons the toilets didn't work is because they had been unnecessarily redesigned. Why had they been unnecessarily redesigned is because, again, there are incredible incentives, not just to build big expensive stuff, but to replace systems that don't need replacing. And it's a metaphor most people are familiar with, is like, right, it's not profitable to make an umbrella that never breaks, because then you don't buy a second one. Or I guess in our case, iPhones, which, the battery life seems increasingly terminal. And so you have systems that worked well enough that still get rebuilt or redesigned or replaced, of course, as cheaply as possible to maximize profit for the manufacturer. And one of the more comical effects of this is that you've replaced the plumbing on aircraft carriers with a new system that can get clogged much more easily by a soldier who wants to flush his t-shirt down the toilet, or by a sailor who wants to flush his t-shirt down the toilet.
This is an incredibly surprising factoid and makes me more disheartened than I expected when I talked to it. When I was thinking about this question, it's like so sad that that's where we're at, that you just have a bunch of fat cats trying to make money at all costs, and the cost is us absolutely shitting the bed in this unnecessary, forever sort of seeming war against Iran.
The military as a whole is mainly a vehicle to transfer taxpayer dollars to corporations and weapons manufacturers, and increasingly, these fascist tech billionaires who have all become de facto defense contractors. Right? When Trump is asking for a $1.5 trillion defense budget, even the $1 trillion defense budget that Congress, including a lot of Democrats, gave him last year, that money is not just going to the guys who make bad aircraft carriers. It's going to the companies like Palantir, run by guys who are actively hostile to the concept of American democracy.
And it seems increasingly like all of this is being turned back on our own. You draw a direct line between the Hexeth's Pentagon and how ICE and Border Patrol are operating domestically, like in LA and Minneapolis and DC. What specifically worries you about a military build, the way that it is being built, being used domestically?
Yeah, the thing that's worrying when you have an administration that is uniquely motivated to use the military against U.S. citizens or against people in America. I live in Washington, D.C. There's still tons of National Guard all over the place. It's quite distressing, especially as somebody who used to wear the same uniform as them, to feel like you're being occupied by the army that you served in. And we can recall they deployed both guardsmen and active duty Marines to LA. They kind of tried to get the National Guard to support federal agents. And you may recall when ICE and Border Patrol were running around Minneapolis terrorizing people and murdering people in the street, J.D. Vance wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act, which makes it legal to deploy the military to do law enforcement. And they actually mobilized, but did not deploy active duty Army paratroopers. They didn't send them, but they were getting ready to. And so I work on this now in my day job of ways to basically help members of the military who find themselves in the situation figure out what to do. And now it's a really big concern leading up to midterms. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has refused to rule out deploying the military in conjunction with midterms. And I think there's a real possibility that they could do it. And there's all kinds of ways you could do it without invoking the Insurrection Act, without necessarily violating the law, where you just send the National Guard somewhere and it's close enough to a polling station that people get scared.
You don't want to go outside if you hear like ICE agents have killed someone in Minneapolis. You're not going to go vote, you know?
Trump is doing a jump off of a ramp that Biden and previous administrations built for him. Trump didn't start U.S. support for Israel. Trump didn't invent ICE. It's possible that we're going to have 1,000 years of Trump Reich, but I'm hopeful, and I'm hoping that's not going to happen. If that's not going to happen, we need to make sure we don't replicate the conditions that brought us Trump twice in the first place. And one of those is being led by people who don't value non-white human life, people who lie, and people who violated the trust of the American public. So you have people like Biden's former national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, his deputy, John Feiner, his secretary of state, Anthony Blinken, their top Middle East guy at the National Security Council, Brett McGurk, and a cast of others. All of them have been welcomed in public life, have been welcomed in polite company, in DC think tanks and academia. All of them have some sort of affiliation or professorship at Ivy League universities. And the biggest concern is that it's clear that at least some of them aspire to return to roles of power again. And it's especially concerning because it's pretty clear that none of them think that they did anything wrong. And those who do sort of understand that they did something wrong with Gaza are not willing to take accountability for it. And people who don't believe they should be held accountable are just about as dangerous as their sociopath colleagues who don't think that they did anything wrong in Gaza in the first place. And so I really want Americans, and especially people who might vote for Democrats or vote in Democratic primaries, to understand that they can't let these people anywhere near the White House or the State Department or the Department of Defense ever again. And I think it's very galling for all of us who witnessed the genocide from the start, especially galling to folks like me who served in it and escaped, to see the people who ordered it or orchestrated it, or at least had important roles facilitating it, continuing to defend their records or continuing to try to explain why we should trust them a second time. When we get into presidential campaign season, I think it's going to be very important to look at not just rhetoric about the U.S.-Israel relationship, because we can see even Rahm Emanuel kind of understands the right stuff to say at this point. Sure. But we do need to look at who they agree to take on as staff and who they refuse to take on as staff. And I think politicians who refuse to do business and to hire the Biden Gaza team have a little more credibility than those who still want to stay friends with them.
Yeah, because there's a lot of, like, the culture has shifted. Palestinians in Gaza, journalists there in Lebanon and in Gaza have shifted the game in many ways about how we feel about what was going on and how it's been going on for decades, really. And so politicians have sort of figured that out, and they seem to be shifting towards the idea that maybe we shouldn't pay wholesale for Israel's weapons against innocent civilians. Do you think, from where you're sitting, that these politicians are really trying to rein Zionists in and change policy, or do you think that they're just trying to scam people like us who are more aware of how murderous and unacceptable it is for us to sort of pay for another country's expansion?
Okay, so there's a spectrum of politicians. There's those who are trying to genuinely, in good faith, rationalize and reform the U.S.-Israel relationship and basically end U.S. facilitation for everything Israel does. And then there's those who understand that they need to pay lip service to this now. And so that lip service, right, that looks like the new Netanyahu approved talking point of make Israel pay for it, which is to say we will stop giving Israel billions of dollars to buy weapons, but we're not going to stop selling them weapons. We're not going to stop defending them with our military. We're not going to stop sharing intelligence with them. And it's really important that people understand that saying, hey, we're going to stop giving weapons to Israel is beyond the bare minimum at this point. Like I said, Netanyahu himself has said, I endorse this policy because instead what they're going to do is try to merge U.S. and Israeli defense production and R&D. So instead of giving them billions of dollars to buy weapons, we're going to give them billions of dollars that's much harder to detect to build a factory, to research a new type of missile. I think it's very important that people who are in politics or aspire to politics are clear. Do they want to stop giving some money to Israel, or do they want to end all arming and equipping of the Israeli military? Do they want a full arms embargo, which means regardless of who pays for it, we are not giving them the munitions and the planes and the fuel that they need to wage war on the entire region? I'm really curious to see, and I have not seen any elected leader, even the ones who are quite aggressive about reducing U.S. support for Israel, haven't seen anybody say this, which is talk about the literal military support, talk about the guided missile destroyers that are in the Gulf and in the Mediterranean to defend Israeli airspace, the hundreds of U.S. air defense troops who are on Israeli soil, some of whom were quite likely wounded in this war, because there have been U.S. troops wounded in Israel since February. We're moving them. The last article I wrote was about how the possibility of putting U.S. bases in Israel basically makes them human shields and encourages aggression. We have a couple very small bases. So,
what's the reason that they want to do that? Like, I don't understand why we would move.
So there's two reasons. One is the idea of a Western basing network, which has been around in DoD and CENTCOM for a while, which is that, wow, it's pretty dangerous to have our Army headquarters, our Navy headquarters, and our Air Force headquarters in the region in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, aka 200 miles from Iran. That turned out to be a real concern when this war started and all those bases got pummeled. So the idea is we got to move them further away, out of the range of at least the short range missiles, to the western side of the Middle East. That could be Egypt, that could be Red Sea, Saudi Arabia, or it could be Israel. And Israel really makes sense because it's got the best air defenses in the region, and it's the most cooperative government, at least when it comes to bombing Iran. And then there's also going to be the Board of Peace base, or bases, one already under construction near the border with Gaza and Israel, and then one planned, I don't know if it'll ever happen, for inside southern Gaza, which theoretically would be like an international base, but the Board of Peace answers to Trump personally, and the commander of the so-called International Stabilization Force is an American general. So, any base that the Board of Peace builds in Israel could very easily become an American base if Trump and Netanyahu wanted.
This has been so fascinating. I appreciate you so much for being on the show, and we'll look out for your writing on Zateo. Just thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thanks, Afif.